On March 20th, the sun hit Earth twice. First, a G3 geomagnetic storm, then a G2 coronal hole stream, one after the other, before the magnetosphere had recovered from the first blow, like striking a bell before it stops ringing. 72 hours later, the largest earthquake of 2026 tore through the Tonga subduction zone at magnitude 7.5, 229 kilometers underground, 9 aftershocks in under a day. Volcanoes elevated across the Ring of Fire from Hawaii to Alaska. Now, maybe the bell and the earthquake have nothing to do with each other. Probably that's what you've been told to think. But stay with me tonight, because the timing of what happened this week is either a remarkable coincidence or the clearest example yet of a pattern nobody wants to officially confirm. Hit subscribe and stay close, because this story has not finished writing itself. The aftershock sequence is still running. The solar window is still open. And the researchers quietly tracking the solar seismic pattern are still pulling data from a week that handed them more alignment than most years produce in total. When new analysis lands on this event, this channel is where you'll hear it first. You'll want to be here for that. Now, let's get into it. At 0437 UTC, a magnitude 7.5 earthquake tore through the Tonga subduction zone, and the timing does not make sense. Not because a large earthquake in Tonga is unusual. It isn't. This is one of the most seismically active corridors on the entire planet. The Pacific Plate has been grinding beneath the Indo-Australian Plate here for millions of years, and it will keep grinding long after every city we've ever built has turned to dust. Tonga gets earthquakes the way London gets rain, frequently, predictably, and without much ceremony. So the earthquake itself isn't the anomaly. What's anomalous is the precise sequence of events that led up to it. Here's what happened in the 72 hours before the ground moved. On March 18th, the sun fired a coronal mass ejection directly toward Earth, a billion-ton cloud of magnetized plasma screaming through space at several million kilometers per hour. It arrived on schedule. March 20th through 21st, Earth's magnetosphere took the hit, and the planet registered a G3 geomagnetic storm, strong enough to push auroras down to mid-latitudes, strong enough to stress satellite systems, strong enough to compress the magnetosphere, and shake it like a snow globe. Then, before the system had even recovered, a second impact arrived. March 22nd, a coronal hole high-speed stream slammed into the magnetosphere and delivered a G2 storm on top of an already disturbed system. And then, 72 hours later, on March 24th, the ground moved. There's a detail that makes this even harder to dismiss. March 20th was the equinox, and researchers who track the relationship between solar activity and seismic events have pointed repeatedly to a specific window, 48 to 120 hours after geomagnetic disturbance, as a period of elevated seismic probability. The Tonga event fell squarely inside that window, not near it, inside it. Now, I want to be precise with you here, because precision is what separates an interesting observation from a conspiracy theory. This is not proof. There is no confirmed causal mechanism that the mainstream scientific community has accepted. What we have is a pattern, a very specific, very precise alignment of events that some researchers track and most scientists treat with deep skepticism. But here's the thing about patterns. Sometimes they're the noise our brains make when we stare too long at randomness. And sometimes they're a signal that we haven't learned to read yet. If this is coincidence, it is a very precise one. Coming up, the earthquake itself was strange before it even started. Because it happened somewhere, earthquakes technically should not be possible at all. The main shock occurred at 229 kilometers below the surface, and that matters more than almost anything else about this event. To put that in perspective, 229 kilometers is roughly the distance from London to Bristol, except straight down, through rock, under pressure so extreme that the material down there doesn't behave like rock anymore. At that depth, you're in a zone geologists call the intermediate depth seismic zone, a band roughly between 70 and 300 kilometers down, where earthquakes shouldn't really be possible, at least not in the way we understand them. Shallow earthquakes, the kind that happen in the top 20 kilometers or so, make intuitive sense. Rock fractures, faults slip, energy radiates outward. That's the basic model. But intermediate depth earthquakes break that model because the pressure and temperature at 200 kilometers should theoretically cause rock to deform plastically, like putty, rather than snap suddenly. The fact that they do snap is something science is still working out. We'll come back to that, because it's genuinely one of the stranger corners of geology. But for now, here's the practical implication of the depth. By the time the energy from a 229-kilometer rupture travels upward through the mantle and crust to the surface, it has lost most of its destructive force. This is why the USGS pager alert came back green. No tsunami was generated. No major infrastructure damage was reported. In terms of direct human impact, the earthquake was, by the numbers, relatively benign for its size, and then the aftershocks started, and two of them showed up at 10 kilometers depth. 10 kilometers. Not 200. Not even 50. 10. Those two aftershocks had migrated from the intermediate depth zone all the way up into the shallow crust, within approximately 3 hours of the main shock. This process has a name. It's called deep to shallow stress transfer, and it describes the idea that energy released at depth can travel upward along structural pathways in the subducting slab, reactivating faults closer to the surface that wouldn't have moved otherwise. We've seen behavior like this in subduction zones beneath Japan and along the west coast of South America. The mechanism is debated. The physics are not fully resolved. But the pattern, a deep rupture followed by shallow aftershock migration, has shown up enough times in the seismic record that it isn't dismissed outright. So the main shock happened at depth, and the damage potential was low. But the system didn't stay at depth. It reached upward. And if energy can travel 200 kilometers upward through solid rock in under 3 hours, the question worth sitting with is what else that energy might be capable of reaching. 9 earthquakes of magnitude, 4.5 or greater, struck the same region within 24 hours of the main shock, and that number deserves more attention than it's getting. Let me walk you through the sequence, because the composition of that aftershock cluster tells a story that a single headline number doesn't capture. 2 of those earthquakes came in at magnitude 5.2. Several hit magnitude 4.9. The remainder ranged between 4.6 and 4.8. These aren't micro tremors that only show up on sensitive instruments. These are events that would, in a quieter week, in a less seismically active region, generate their own news coverage. The aftershocks were clustered tightly in the same zone west of Neafu, and most of them occurred between 192 and 268 kilometers depth, still in that intermediate zone, still in the same general structural environment as the main shock, which is, in itself, unusual. Here's why. Shallow earthquakes, the kind that happen in the brittle upper crust, tend to generate rapid, numerous aftershock sequences. The crust is fractured, fluid saturated, and highly heterogeneous, so stress propagates quickly through a network of pre-existing weaknesses. Intermediate depth earthquakes don't usually behave this way. The rock is denser, the structures are more coherent, and the mechanism driving the earthquake in the first place is fundamentally different. You'd expect fewer aftershocks, more widely spaced in time. What you wouldn't necessarily expect is 9 events above 4.5 within a single day, with the sequence still ongoing. This looks less like a classic main shock aftershock pattern, where one big rupture releases stored stress and the system settles. It looks more like a slab that is adjusting, not along a single fault plane, but across a region. The difference matters. A single fault rupture is a discrete event with a predictable decay curve. A slab adjustment is a process, and processes have implications that extend beyond their immediate location. The aftershock swarm in Tonga may not be the end of something. It may be the visible surface of something much larger, shifting underneath, and that something, as it turns out, may not be confined to Tonga at all. Earth produced approximately 113 earthquakes of magnitude 4.5 or greater in the 7 days surrounding this event, and that is completely normal. This is something worth establishing clearly, because it's easy to fall into the trap of thinking that seismic activity is unusual simply because we're paying attention to it. Earth is seismically active all the time. Every week, dozens of magnitude 4+ earthquakes ripple across the planet, most of them unfelt, most of them unreported, most of them occurring in the ocean or in sparsely populated regions where nobody is watching. The planet is not a stable, quiet rock. It is a dynamic, pressurized system with a partially molten interior and a fractured moving surface, and it moves constantly. That baseline matters, because it means the Tonga 7.5 doesn't stand out simply because it happened. It stands out because of its magnitude relative to everything else. The rest of the week's notable activity looked like this: a magnitude 5.2 and a 4.6 in the Aleutian Islands, a cluster of 4.5 to 4.9 events in the Japan and Izu region, a grouping of 4.6 to 4.9 earthquakes along the Chilean coast. All of these are consistent with normal background activity along the Pacific Rim. None of them are individually remarkable. The magnitude 7.5 in Tonga is larger than all of them combined in terms of energy release. Magnitude is a logarithmic scale, which means a 7.5 releases roughly 32 times more energy than a 6.5, and roughly 1,000 times more energy than a 5.5. The Tonga event was the dominant seismic event of the week by a wide margin. Not slightly larger, not meaningfully larger, but categorically larger. Now, magnitude 7.5 earthquakes are not extraordinarily rare. Earth produces roughly 15 magnitude 7 or greater earthquakes in a typical year. So by frequency alone, this event falls within normal statistical expectations. But frequency isn't the story here. The story is context. And to understand the context, you need to go somewhere the numbers don't take you, into the actual structure of the system that produced this earthquake. Because what's happening underneath Tonga is, in some ways, one of the strangest geological processes on the planet. The Pacific Plate is moving toward the Tonga Trench at approximately 24 centimeters per year, and that is extraordinarily fast by the standards of plate tectonics. To put that number in context, the Atlantic Ocean is widening at roughly 2 to 3 centimeters per year. The Himalayas are rising at about 5 centimeters per year. The Pacific Plate's descent into the Tonga Trench is moving at nearly 10 times the rate of many other major tectonic boundaries on Earth. In geological terms, this is not a slow grind. This is a sprint. What that speed means in practice is that the Pacific Plate is diving, or subducting, beneath the Indo-Australian Plate at an almost violent rate. Think of it as a conveyor belt plunging into the mantle, carrying cold, dense, oceanic crust downward into rock that is hundreds of degrees hotter and under pressure that increases by roughly 300 atmospheres for every kilometer of depth. As the slab descends, it doesn't go smoothly. It buckles. It bends. It resists the pressure around it, and then, periodically, it snaps. That snapping is what we measure as earthquakes. The Tonga Kermadec subduction system is one of the most seismically productive in the world precisely because of this speed. Events occur at all depths, shallow ruptures near the trench, intermediate events like this week's 7.5, and deep focus earthquakes occurring at 400, 500, even 600 kilometers below the surface. The region has produced some of the largest intermediate and deep earthquakes ever recorded. A magnitude 8.2 struck the Kermadec region in 2021. Multiple magnitude 7+ events have occurred in recent years. But here's what makes this week's event particularly interesting, and it gets to the question of why any earthquake should occur at 229 kilometers at all. Because by the standard rules of geology, it shouldn't. There is a fundamental problem with intermediate depth earthquakes, and geologists have been arguing about it for decades. The issue is this: at depths greater than roughly 70 to 80 kilometers, the pressure and temperature conditions inside a subducting slab should cause rock to deform without fracturing. This is called ductile behavior. The rock flows slowly rather than breaking suddenly. And earthquakes require sudden fracture. They require the kind of brittle, snapping behavior that you associate with shallow crustal rock. So by the standard model of how rocks behave under pressure, intermediate depth earthquakes like this week's 7.5 simply shouldn't exist. And yet they do. Every week, including this one. The two leading explanations for how this is possible are both strange in their own right. The first is called dehydration embrittlement. As the subducting oceanic plate descends, the intense pressure and heat force water out of the minerals locked inside the rock. Minerals like serpentinite and chlorite, which form during the plate's time at the ocean floor, are hydrated. They contain water in their crystal structure. As they are carried downward, the changing conditions cause them to release that water into the surrounding rock, and this fluid injection temporarily reduces the effective pressure on nearby faults, allowing the rock to behave as if it were shallower and more brittle than it actually is. The water, in effect, lubricates a fracture that shouldn't be able to open. The second mechanism is called transformational faulting. At certain depths, the mineral olivine, one of the most abundant minerals in the upper mantle, undergoes a phase transformation, reorganizing its crystal structure into a denser form called spinel. This transformation can happen unevenly, and the stress imbalances created by uneven transformation can produce sudden, catastrophic slip, an earthquake, even in rock that is nominally too warm and pressurized to fracture. Both mechanisms are still actively debated. Neither has been confirmed as the dominant process for any given event. And the aftershock clustering from this week's 7.5 may actually offer clues about which mechanism was at work, because the spatial distribution of aftershocks reflects the geometry of the zone that fractured. And that geometry depends on whether you're dealing with a dehydration front or a mineral transformation boundary. The honest answer is that we are watching a process we don't fully understand in real time, with instruments that are only beginning to resolve the details. And the structure it's happening inside may be even stranger than the process itself. Subducting slabs are not smooth, continuous sheets of rock sliding cleanly into the mantle, and this is a detail that most earthquake coverage completely misses. The popular mental image of subduction is something like a flat piece of cardboard being pushed under a rug, orderly, gradual, continuous. The reality is considerably more violent. As a slab descends at 24 centimeters per year into progressively hotter and denser material, it doesn't remain rigid. It deforms. It folds. In some regions, seismic imaging has revealed that subducting slabs can tear apart horizontally, creating gaps and discontinuities in what was once a coherent plate. In others, the slab appears to buckle and pool at depth, piling up rather than penetrating cleanly through the transition zone. The Tonga subduction system is known, from seismic tomography studies, to have a particularly complex slab geometry. The slab here is not a clean, flat ramp. It curves, it thickens, and there are regions where its coherence is questionable. This matters for understanding this week's earthquake, because slab discontinuities, gaps, tears, fold zones create irregular stress pathways. Rather than stress being distributed smoothly along a continuous structure, it concentrates at structural boundaries, and when it releases, it can release in ways that don't conform to the predictable patterns of fault plane rupture. The tight clustering of aftershocks west of Neafu may reflect this kind of structural irregularity. Rather than spreading outward along a simple fault plane, the aftershocks appear to be nucleating within a defined zone, which is more consistent with rupture along a structural boundary in the slab than with classic fault plane aftershock migration. There's also this: if the slab is fragmented, if stress is already being redistributed along a discontinuous structure, then seismic signals don't propagate the way clean models predict. They scatter, they jump, they show up in unexpected places. One of those unexpected places showed up on the same day, approximately 450 kilometers to the northwest. On the same day that the magnitude 7.5 struck Tonga at 229 kilometers depth, a magnitude 4.7 earthquake occurred south of Fiji at approximately 490 kilometers depth. 490 kilometers. That is nearly twice as deep as the Tonga main shock. It is in what seismologists call the deep focus zone, earthquakes below 300 kilometers. And at that depth, the mechanisms responsible for earthquake generation are even less well understood than the intermediate depth processes we just discussed. Taken in isolation, a magnitude 4.7 near Fiji is not a notable event. The broader Tonga-Fiji-Vanuatu region produces deep focus earthquakes regularly. The subduction system here is complex, the slab geometry is irregular, and seismic activity at multiple depth levels is expected. But the timing, same day, same regional system, different depth, raises a question that is worth sitting with. Are these two events independent? Is this a coincidence of geography and timing? Or does it reflect something about the state of the slab across a wider region on this particular day? No direct link has been established. There is no mechanism confirmed in the literature that would connect a 229-kilometer event in Tonga to a 490-kilometer event near Fiji in a causal way. The distance, the depth difference, and the magnitude difference all argue for treating these as separate events. And yet, multiple depths, same regional system, same day. The honest answer is that we don't know. The uncomfortable answer is that the tools we have for detecting slab-scale stress patterns are still primitive relative to the scale of the structures we're trying to map. But here's what we do know. Something was happening above the Earth that day too. Something solar. 6 days before the ground moved in Tonga, the sun launched a coronal mass ejection directly toward Earth. A coronal mass ejection is not a subtle event. It is a billion-ton cloud of magnetized plasma erupting from the solar surface and accelerating through space at speeds that can reach several million kilometers per hour. The sun produces these events regularly, more frequently during solar maximum, which is where we are right now in the current solar cycle. But not all of them are aimed at Earth, and not all of them that are aimed at Earth actually connect with the magnetosphere in a meaningful way. The geometry of the magnetic field matters. The speed matters. The density of the plasma matters. This one connected. The active region responsible had been building up over several days, cycling through a series of solar flares before producing the CME on March 18th. Space weather agencies tracked it in real time. This is standard practice now, and the monitoring infrastructure is genuinely impressive. NOAA's Space Weather Prediction Center, the European Space Agency, and several other organizations maintain continuous watch on solar activity and provide forecasts for the arrival time and expected intensity of incoming space weather events. The forecast for this CME put its arrival at Earth at approximately 2 days after launch, which is typical for a moderately fast ejection. The estimated impact window was March 20th to 21st. That date is not arbitrary. March 20th was the spring equinox. And as it turns out, the equinox is one of the most significant timing factors in the entire story. Not because of anything mystical, but because of a specific and well-documented effect in magnetospheric physics that makes geomagnetic storms during equinox windows systematically more intense than identical storms at other times of year. We'll get to that. But first, the impact itself. The CME arrived, and Earth's magnetosphere registered a G3 geomagnetic storm, the third strongest category on NOAA's 5-level scale, with a KP index that peaked near 7.0. To understand what that means in practical terms, it helps to understand what the KP index is actually measuring. The KP index is a global measure of geomagnetic disturbance, running from 0, completely quiet, to 9, extreme storm. A KP of 7 is not catastrophic. Satellites remain operational. Power grids don't automatically fail. Aircraft passengers don't absorb dangerous radiation doses. But a KP of 7 is not nothing either. At KP 7, the magnetosphere is compressed. The boundary between Earth's magnetic field and the solar wind, normally sitting at roughly 10 Earth radii on the day side, gets pushed inward. The magnetotail on the night side stretches and snaps. Charged particles from the solar wind penetrate deeper into the magnetosphere than they normally would, generating auroras that extend far beyond their usual polar zones. During this event, aurora reports came in from mid-latitude locations that normally never see them. More relevant to the story we're building here, at KP7, there are measurable effects on Earth's crust. Geomagnetically induced currents, electrical currents driven through the ground by the changing magnetic field overhead, increase in intensity. Long conductive structures like pipelines and power transmission lines act as antennas, picking up these currents and registering voltage anomalies. The ground itself becomes electrically active in a way it normally isn't. The storm lasted approximately 18 hours at elevated intensity before beginning to decay. The system was still in recovery, still disturbed, still processing the energy input from the CME when the second event arrived, and almost nobody was paying attention to the second event. While the news cycle was still processing the G3 storm and the aurora photographs were still circulating on social media, a coronal whole high-speed stream arrived at Earth's magnetosphere, and it delivered a G2 geomagnetic storm on top of an already destabilized system. A coronal hole is a region on the sun's surface where the magnetic field opens outward into space rather than looping back, allowing solar wind to flow out at higher than normal speeds. These high-speed streams don't carry the explosive energy of a coronal mass ejection, but they are persistent and steady. Rather than a single sharp impact, they deliver a sustained increase in solar wind pressure and velocity that can maintain elevated geomagnetic activity for 12 to 24 hours or more. The G2 storm that resulted peaked at a KP of approximately 6.67. That's below the G3 threshold, but it matters enormously in the context of what had just happened. The magnetosphere was already disturbed. The induced current systems in the crust were already activated. The particle populations in the magnetosphere were still enhanced from the CME impact. And then another impact arrived before the system had returned to baseline. There's a useful analogy here. Imagine striking a bell, and before the tone has faded, striking it again. The second strike doesn't just add its own tone, it interacts with the residual vibration from the first strike, creating interference patterns and sustaining the disturbance for longer than either strike would have alone. The magnetosphere in late March was, in effect, still ringing when it got hit a second time. The combined disturbance window from the first G3 impact through the tail end of the G2 coronal hole stream spanned roughly 3 days, the geomagnetic system was continuously disturbed from March 20th through approximately March 23rd. The Tonga magnitude 7.5 struck on March 24th at 0437 UTC. 72 hours after the onset of the G3 storm. There is a hypothesis in the fringes of geophysics, not in the mainstream, not taught in standard coursework, but present in the literature, in conference proceedings, and in the work of a small number of researchers who have spent careers tracking it, that suggests earthquakes are statistically more likely in the 48 to 120 hours following significant geomagnetic disturbance. The claim is not that solar storms cause earthquakes directly. Nobody credible is arguing that a coronal mass ejection reaches out and physically moves a fault. The claim is subtler, that geomagnetic storms create secondary effects in Earth's crust, electrical, mechanical, thermal, that can nudge fault systems already loaded with tectonic stress closer to the threshold of rupture. Not creating the stress, not generating the earthquake from nothing, just shifting the probability slightly, temporarily, for systems that are already near the breaking point. Some peer-reviewed studies have claimed to find this correlation in global seismic catalogs. Others have looked at the same data and found nothing. The statistical challenges are genuine. Earth produces dozens of earthquakes every week, and if you're looking for a correlation with a window that spans several days, the probability of chance alignment is non-trivial. Critics point out that researchers in this field sometimes selectively report the events that fit the pattern and quietly ignore the many geomagnetic storms that weren't followed by notable seismic activity. These are fair criticisms. The science is not settled. The mechanism is not confirmed. But the Tonga event falls directly inside that window. Not near it. Not loosely associated with it. Directly inside it at 72 hours. Essentially the center of the proposed 48 to 120 hour range. The question this raises isn't whether one earthquake proves the hypothesis. It doesn't. The question is whether, when the timing alignment is this precise, and when additional factors are also aligned, we should be thinking about this as purely coincidental, or whether we're looking at something that our statistical methods aren't yet sensitive enough to confirm. And there is one more factor in the timing alignment that most coverage of this event has completely overlooked. There is a phenomenon in magnetospheric physics called the Russell-McPherron effect, and it was identified in 1973, and it is the reason that geomagnetic storms are systematically more intense during the weeks around the equinoxes than at any other time of year. The effect is real, it is well documented, and it is taught in space weather courses. This is not fringe science. This is textbook magnetospheric physics. I'm starting here because I want you to understand that what follows isn't speculation, it's established. Here's the basic mechanism. The direction of Earth's magnetic field relative to the solar wind is determined by a combination of Earth's axial tilt and its orbital position. During the equinoxes, roughly March 20th and September 23rd, the geometry of Earth's magnetic axis relative to the interplanetary magnetic field aligns in a way that maximizes what's called magnetic reconnection, the process by which solar wind energy crosses the boundary of the magnetosphere and enters the system. At the solstices, that coupling is less efficient. At the equinoxes, it peaks. The practical consequence is this. A given solar storm, same speed, same density, same magnetic field orientation, will produce a stronger geomagnetic response at the equinox than it would in June or December. The storm is amplified by the geometry of the season. The G3 storm that struck Earth on March 20th arrived at essentially the moment of the equinox. The coupling efficiency was at or near its annual peak. The same event, arriving 6 weeks earlier or 6 weeks later, would likely have produced a G2, perhaps even a G1 response. Instead, it produced a G3, and then a G2 on top of it, which raises a question. If the storms were amplified by the equinox geometry, were the secondary effects on the crust also amplified? When geomagnetic storm intensity is enhanced by the Russell-McPherron effect, the enhancement isn't just about aurora visibility or satellite drag. It propagates through the entire chain of effects that a geomagnetic storm produces, including the effects on the crust. Solar wind energy enters the magnetosphere more efficiently during equinox geometry. That energy drives stronger and more sustained electrical current systems in the ionosphere, the electrically conductive layer of the upper atmosphere, roughly 60 to 1,000 kilometers above the surface. Those ionospheric currents, in turn, generate more intense geomagnetically induced ground currents. The electrical layer interacting with the crust becomes more active, not marginally, but measurably. Studies tracking geomagnetically induced currents, the kind that stress power grids and pipelines, consistently show elevated activity during equinox-aligned storms. The March 20th through 22nd event window almost certainly produced higher ground current intensities than the same storm would have at a different point in the year. This is not a controversial statement in space weather science. It's what the physics predicts, and it's what observational records show. Where the science becomes less certain, and where we start moving from established physics into active research, is in the question of whether those elevated ground currents have any measurable influence on geological systems. Because the Earth's crust is a conductor. It is not perfectly uniform, not perfectly isotropic, but it is electrically active, and it responds to external electrical forcing. And there is a specific mechanism, studied by a small but credentialed group of researchers, that proposes exactly how that electrical forcing might translate into seismic influence. Beneath every continent, beneath every ocean floor, flowing through the fractured and fluid-saturated crust, there are electrical currents. They are called telluric currents, from the Latin word for earth, and they exist because the crust is not a perfect electrical insulator. They arise from multiple sources. The slow drift of the conducting fluid, outer core, generates long-period currents. The interaction of the ionosphere with the surface generates others, and during geomagnetic storms, externally driven ground currents add a transient, intense layer on top of the background. The total picture is an Earth that is, at all times, threaded through with flowing electrical charge, invisible, unmeasured in most places, but present. The hypothesis connecting these currents to seismic activity goes roughly like this. Many fault zones are fluid saturated. The presence of fluid in a fault, water in most cases, has a well-established mechanical effect. It increases pore pressure, which reduces the normal stress clamping the fault closed, which reduces the friction holding the fault in place. A fault that is loaded with tectonic stress and saturated with fluid is a fault closer to failure than a dry fault under identical tectonic loading. The proposed mechanism is that telluric currents, particularly when enhanced by geomagnetic storms, can drive electro-osmotic fluid movement through fault zones. Essentially, the electrical current pushes fluid through permeable rock, temporarily increasing pore pressure in regions that were already near failure. The friction clamping the fault drops slightly. The fault, already loaded with stress from decades of tectonic compression, moves. This is still a hypothesis. It has not been confirmed experimentally in a natural fault system. The scale of the proposed effect, whether it's large enough to actually trigger earthquakes rather than simply perturb them slightly, is contested. Many seismologists consider the effect too small to matter, but many of the same seismologists said the same thing about tidal triggering. The idea that the gravitational pull of the moon and sun could influence earthquake timing and subsequent high-resolution analysis of seismic catalogs has found statistically significant tidal triggering in multiple fault systems. Small effects, acting on faults already near failure are not necessarily negligible. So the question becomes, is what happened in Tonga a signal buried in geological noise? Or is it noise that we're misreading as a signal? Here is the honest statistical reality of trying to connect solar storms to earthquakes. Earth produces approximately 15 magnitude 7 or greater earthquakes per year. That's roughly one every 3 to 4 weeks. If you define a solar seismic window as 48 to 120 hours after a storm, and if strong geomagnetic storms occur several times per year, the probability of a magnitude 7+ earthquake coincidentally falling within that window at some location on Earth is genuinely significant. This is not a trivial objection. It's the core methodological challenge facing every researcher who has tried to establish this correlation rigorously. When your effect window is several days wide and your target events occur multiple times per month globally, false positives are easy to generate and hard to rule out. You need very large data sets, very careful controls for the spatial and temporal clustering of earthquakes, and transparent methodology that doesn't cherry-pick the events that fit. Some researchers claim to have done exactly that. Papers in journals like the Journal of Geophysical Research and Earth and Planetary Science Letters have reported statistically significant correlations between geomagnetic activity and global seismicity in some frequency bands and magnitude ranges. Other papers using different methodologies and different catalog subsets have found no such correlation. The literature is genuinely mixed. What we can say is this: the pattern that some researchers track, geomagnetic disturbance followed by elevated seismic probability in the 48 to 120 hour window, aligns with the Tonga event in a way that is striking whether or not it is causal. The event did not just loosely fall near a solar storm, it fell precisely inside the proposed window, during an equinox that amplified the storm's intensity, after a double impact sequence that sustained geomagnetic disturbance for 3 consecutive days. Whether that is signal or noise may ultimately depend on how many more events like this accumulate before someone runs the numbers rigorously enough to settle the question. And while we've been focused on Tonga, something worth noticing has been happening at the other end of the Pacific. The Pacific Ring of Fire is active at both of its polar extremes simultaneously, and that is a detail the week's seismic data makes difficult to ignore. At the southern end, the Tonga magnitude 7.5, the 9+ aftershock sequence, the magnitude 4.7 near Fiji at 490 kilometers depth. At the northern end, a magnitude 5.2 earthquake in the Rat Island section of the Aleutian Chain, and a magnitude 4.6 in the Andreanof Islands, another segment of the same Aleutian arc. Both Aleutian events occurred within days of the Tonga main shock. The Aleutian Islands are, geologically, a mirror image of Tonga in several ways. The Pacific Plate subducts beneath the North American Plate along the Aleutian Trench, creating one of the longest subduction zones on Earth, stretching over 2,400 kilometers from Alaska to the Kamchatka Peninsula. This system produced the 1964 magnitude 9.2 Alaska earthquake, still one of the largest ever recorded. It is, like Tonga, a fast-moving, highly productive seismic zone. A magnitude 5.2 in the Aleutians is not individually remarkable. These events occur regularly, but the context is what makes the geographic coincidence worth noting. In the same week that the southern end of the Pacific Plate subduction system produced its largest earthquake in months, the northern end was also producing elevated activity. This does not prove anything. Correlation at two ends of a plate boundary is not the same as a mechanical connection between those two ends, but it frames a question. Is the Pacific Plate, as a system, in a more actively releasing state this week than it was last week? And if so, what drove that shift? The seismic picture becomes more textured when you add the volcanic status indicators that were active during the same week. Kilauea, on the Big Island of Hawaii, was under a watch status, the second of 4 alert levels used by the USGS Hawaiian Volcano Observatory, indicating elevated unrest and the possibility of an eruption, though not imminent eruptive activity at the surface. Keirlauia is one of the most continuously active volcanoes on Earth, so elevated alert status there is not automatically alarming. But watch means the system is doing something. Seismicity is elevated, ground deformation is occurring, or volcanic gas emissions are changing in a way that warrants closer monitoring. Great Sitkan Volcano in the Aleutian Islands was also at watch status. Great Sitkan has been in a low-level eruption phase for the past several years, with periodic lava extrusion in the summit crater, but the watch designation indicates that activity has elevated beyond its recent background level. Additionally, several other Aleutian volcanoes were at advisory status, one level below watch, including systems along the same arc that produced the week's magnitude 5.2 earthquake. No major eruptions occurred during the week. This is not a story about simultaneous volcanic disasters, but volcano alert levels are not arbitrary bureaucratic designations. They reflect real-time monitoring data from seismic networks, GPS ground deformation sensors, gas sensors, and satellite thermal imaging. When multiple volcanoes in the same arc are simultaneously at elevated alert levels, those alert levels reflect simultaneous elevated unrest across multiple independent magmatic systems fed by the same subducting plate. Different systems, different summit elevations, different eruption histories, same plate delivering fluids and heat from below. There is a concept in tectonics called stress shadowing, the idea that a large earthquake in one region can temporarily reduce the likelihood of earthquakes in adjacent regions by releasing stored stress. Its counterpart, stress loading, describes how a large earthquake can increase stress on nearby fault segments that didn't rupture in the main shock, making them more likely to fail in the near future. Both effects are real and well documented at local scales, within a few fault lengths of the main shock. The scientific evidence for stress transfer effects at the scale of an entire tectonic plate, thousands of kilometers, is far less established. Most seismologists would be skeptical of any claim that the Tonga magnitude 7.5 mechanically influenced the Aleutian events through direct stress transfer. But there's a less direct way to think about plate-scale seismic clustering that doesn't require direct mechanical linkage. If the entire Pacific Plate boundary system is being subjected to an external influence, whether that's an enhanced geomagnetic disturbance, a period of elevated tidal forcing, or something else that acts at a planetary scale, then elevated activity at multiple points along that boundary simultaneously might reflect not a chain of causation from one event to the next, but a shared response to a shared driver. This is speculative. It is not established science, but it is the kind of thinking that, historically, precedes the identification of new mechanisms when observers notice that something is happening across a system simultaneously and ask whether there might be a shared explanation rather than a series of coincidences. The Pacific Rim was not quiet this week. The question worth sitting with is whether that widespread unrest has a single explanation, multiple independent explanations, or something in between. Before we go further, there's something important to say about human perception, because it's directly relevant to everything we've been discussing. The human brain is extraordinarily good at finding patterns. This is not a flaw. It is one of the most powerful cognitive capabilities we have, and it is probably the reason our species survived long enough to build seismometers and satellite networks. The ability to detect patterns in noisy, incomplete data is what gave early humans the ability to predict animal migration routes, seasonal weather shifts, and the behavior of predators. The problem is that the same pattern detection system runs constantly, even when there's no real pattern to find. Psychologists call this apophenia, the spontaneous perception of connections between unrelated things. and it is almost certainly responsible for some fraction of the solar seismic correlation claims that have circulated in the literature, and, even more so, in online communities where careful statistical controls are not applied. The Ring of Fire is always active. Every week, there are earthquakes in Tonga, and in the Aleutians, and in Japan, and in Chile, and in Alaska. Every month, there are geomagnetic storms. Every year, there are equinoxes. If you are looking for alignments between these things, you will find them, because the events are frequent enough that chance alignment is common. That said, sometimes the pattern is real. Sometimes the signal is buried in the noise, and it takes decades of careful work to extract it. The history of science is full of examples where an observed pattern that initially looked like apophenia turned out to reflect genuine causation once the mechanism was understood. Which brings us to the question this whole video has been building toward. Is what we saw this week one of those cases? When you look at the full picture of what happened this week, the magnitude 7.5 in Tonga, the aftershock swarm, the shallow aftershock migration, the G3 and G2 storms, the equinox timing, the Aleutian activity, the elevated volcanic unrest across the Pacific, you are basically looking at three different explanatory frameworks, and they don't fully agree with each other. The first framework is standard tectonics. The Pacific plate is one of the fastest moving plates on Earth. The Tonga subduction zone is one of the most productive seismic systems in the world. A magnitude 7.5, there is not surprising at any given moment. The aftershock sequence, while somewhat unusual in its depth and pace, falls within the range of documented intermediate depth earthquake behavior. The Aleutian events are independent activity on a separate section of the boundary. The volcanic unrest is background noise from systems that are chronically active. Under this framework, this week's events are a statistically ordinary cluster of activity that our pattern recognition brains have elevated into a narrative. The second framework is slab dynamics. The Tonga slab is fragmented and geometrically complex. The 7.5 may have occurred along a structural discontinuity in the slab, and the subsequent aftershock behavior, including the shallow migration, reflects stress redistribution along a system that is not a simple fault plane, but a complex, partially delaminated structure. The Fiji Deep event on the same day reflects regional slab dynamics operating across a wide area. Under this framework, the week's events are explained by the internal mechanics of a complex geological system, with no need to invoke external drivers. The third framework adds solar seismic influence. The enhanced geomagnetic storms, amplified by the equinox Russell-McPherron effect, produced elevated telluric currents in the crust. Those currents temporarily increased fluid pressure in already loaded fault systems within the Tonga subduction zone, nudging the system past its rupture threshold. The 72-hour gap is not coincidence, but the time required for the electroosmotic fluid redistribution to reach critical levels. Under this framework, the timing is not noise. It is the signal. All three frameworks have internal logic. All three have supporting evidence. None of them is individually sufficient. Here's where it gets interesting, because each of these three frameworks has a specific gap that the others potentially fill. Standard tectonics does a reasonable job of explaining the existence of the earthquake. Tonga is seismically active. The plate is fast-moving. Large earthquakes are expected, but it does not explain the timing. Tectonic stress accumulates over decades and releases when the fault is ready. That process has no particular reason to align with a 72-hour window following a geomagnetic storm during an equinox. If timing is purely a function of tectonic loading, then the precise overlap with the solar event window is coincidence. And coincidences are possible. But claiming coincidence is also the intellectually easiest response, and intellectual ease is not the same as correctness. The slab dynamics framework explains the aftershock behavior beautifully. The clustering, the shallow migration, the Fiji deep event. All of these fit a picture of a structurally complex slab responding to an internal rupture in non-uniform ways. But slab dynamics also doesn't explain the timing. Slab structure doesn't change on a 72-hour timescale. The slab was fragmented before the storm arrived. It was fragmented after the storm. If slab structure was the dominant control on when this earthquake occurred, it should have occurred independently of the solar timeline. The solar seismic framework explains the timing. It provides a mechanism, albeit a contested one, for why a fault system that was loaded and geometrically primed for rupture chose this specific moment to release. But it doesn't explain the aftershock behavior on its own. It doesn't explain why the shallow migration happened. And critically, it cannot yet explain why, given the number of geomagnetic storms that occur each year and the number of loaded fault systems on Earth, the correspondence between storms and large earthquakes isn't more consistent and more obvious in the global seismic record. Each framework explains part of the picture. None explains the whole picture. And the most intellectually honest position is probably that all three are contributing. This is not the first time that researchers have noticed a clustering of seismic events following strong solar activity during equinox windows. Claims of solar seismic correlation have appeared in the scientific literature since at least the 1970s. The claimed pattern has been described in multiple forms. Elevated global seismicity in the days following geomagnetic storms, clustering of large earthquakes near solar maximum, preferential occurrence of major events in the days around lunar and solar tidal peaks. Some of these claims have survived methodological scrutiny better than others. Some have not survived at all. But the recurring nature of the observation, the fact that researchers across decades and across different methodological approaches keep noticing what looks like a connection, is itself a data point. The concept of a probability shift is useful here. Nobody serious is arguing that geomagnetic storms predict earthquakes in the way that a weather forecast predicts rain. The relationship, if it exists, is not deterministic. It is statistical. It shifts the distribution of rupture probability slightly, perhaps meaningfully, perhaps not, in the hours and days following significant solar activity. A system that had a 1% chance of rupturing on any given day might briefly have a 1.2% chance during and after a strong storm. That difference is almost impossible to see in a short time series. It might only become visible in a dataset spanning many solar cycles. We are, right now, somewhere in the middle of solar cycle 25, which has been more active than forecasters predicted. The next several years will bring more solar maximum activity, more frequent coronal mass ejections, more geomagnetic storms. And with better seismic networks than we've ever had, with global earthquake catalogs more complete than at any point in history, the coming years represent an opportunity to either confirm or definitively reject the solar seismic hypothesis with more statistical power than any previous generation of researchers had available. We may be watching the beginning of an answer. Let's go back to where we started. 0437 UTC, a magnitude 7.5, tears through rock at 229 kilometers below the surface of the Pacific Ocean. 72 hours earlier, Earth's magnetosphere was absorbing the second of two consecutive geomagnetic storms, a G3 and a G2, delivered during the equinox window, when our magnetic coupling to the solar wind was at its annual peak. The same equinox that amplifies storms. The same 72-hour gap that appears in solar seismic research. The same subduction zone that is known, from seismic imaging, to host a fragmented and geometrically complex slab. The same region that produced a deep focus earthquake near Fiji on the same day. The same week that volcanoes at both ends of the Pacific Rim elevated their alert status simultaneously. How many alignments before it matters? That's not a rhetorical question. It's a genuine methodological one. In science, a single data point doesn't establish a pattern. 10 data points, poorly controlled, don't establish a pattern either. The history of the solar seismic hypothesis is littered with claims that looked compelling in small datasets and dissolved under rigorous analysis. The people arguing against the hypothesis aren't being closed-minded. They're applying the kind of rigor that separates science from storytelling. But the people who keep looking for the pattern aren't being credulous either. They're responding to something real, a persistent signal in the data that hasn't been convincingly explained away, even if it hasn't been convincingly confirmed. The gap between not confirmed and not real is wider than most science communication acknowledges. What I keep coming back to, after building this picture piece by piece, is the scale of what we're actually talking about. We live on the surface of a planet whose interior is in constant motion, whose magnetic shield is in constant interaction with a star 93 million miles away, whose crust is threaded through with electrical currents we can barely measure and barely understand. The tectonic system and the solar system are not separate. They share a planet. They interact through a magnetosphere, through an atmosphere, through a crust that is more electrically, magnetically, and dynamically active than our simple maps suggest. The Tonga earthquake may be exactly what standard tectonics says it is, a normal earthquake in an active subduction zone that happened by chance to follow a solar storm during an equinox. That's a complete and defensible explanation. Or it may be evidence of a connection we don't fully understand yet, between a star and its third planet, mediated by fields and currents and pressures that operate at scales we've only recently developed the tools to observe. We're not just watching earthquakes, we're watching a system, vast, interconnected, partly invisible, partly incomprehensible, that we are only beginning to learn how to read. And the question worth carrying with you isn't whether the sun triggered this earthquake. The question is whether we're finally paying close enough attention to find out.